The fundamental violation of the modern extraction grid is not the theft of your labor during the daylight hours, but the unauthorized systemic invasion of your biological darkness. We are executing the dissection of the sleep tax, the specific mechanism by which the 24/7 availability required by the network converts your physiological recovery phase into a depreciating asset. You have been conditioned to view sleep as a passive state of non-productivity, an inefficiency to be minimized through caffeine and algorithmic stimulation. This is a lethal misunderstanding of human anatomy. In the visceral baseline of the predator, sleep is not rest. It is the absolute high-friction crystallization of the biological weapon. It is the only phase where the organism ceases to bleed ATP and initiates the total reconstruction of the cellular grid. By demanding your connectivity at all hours, the system is not asking for your time. The system is invading your territory, systematically preventing your biology from ever repairing the damage inflicted by the day. This is the definition of the 24/7 availability trap, a systemic drift designed to keep the human node in a permanent, chronic state of cellular bankruptcy, entirely incapable of generating the metabolic surplus required to resist. At the visceral baseline, the capacity to operate as a sovereign architect is strictly governed by the thermodynamics of the endocrine system. The human organism functions on a dual-phase metabolic ledger, the catabolic phase of the day, where tissue is broken down to release energy, and the anabolic phase of the night, where the system utilizes deep slow-wave sleep to execute the repair, growth, and crystallization of new cellular structures. The modern interface, with its asynchronous communication, globalized markets, and the dopamine trigger of the nighttime notification, has engineered the total liquidation of the anabolic phase. When the grid demands your attention at 2 in the morning, it does not merely steal your time. It initiates a catastrophic visceral breach. The sudden illumination of the retina by the blue light of the screen immediately suppresses the pineal gland's secretion of melatonin, the neurochemical signal for biological maintenance. The grid replaces it with a synthetic surge of cortisol, the hormone of acute survival. This is the physiological definition of ATP exhaustion. Your body is tricked into believing it is being hunted in the dark. The metabolic pathways immediately shift back into catabolism. Your heart rate variability collapses. Your blood pressure spikes. The liver releases emergency glucose into the bloodstream to prepare for a physical conflict that will never materialize. The energy required to rebuild your musculoskeletal density, to repair the micro tears in the cardiac tissue, to regenerate the gut lining. All of this metabolic currency is diverted to process a digital phantom. You are burning your own bone marrow to read an email. The grid is effectively taxing your longevity, extracting the literal years from the end of your lifespan to maximize your responsiveness in the present. The physical posture of the node reflects this nocturnal assault. The eyes are permanently inflamed, the skin loses its structural elasticity, and the skeletal frame sinks into a state of liquid exhaustion. You become physically soft, easily manipulated, and biologically too weak to construct the boundaries required for sovereignty. Transitioning from the biological substrate to the neural architecture, we observe the specific mechanics of cognitive assassination. The human brain is an organic engine that generates a massive amount of toxic metabolic waste during its waking operations. In the solid history of the species, the deep sleep phase triggered the activation of the glymphatic system, a hydraulic mechanism that physically shrinks the brain cells to allow cerebrospinal fluid to wash away the accumulated neurotoxins. This is the high-friction maintenance required for the preservation of the prefrontal cortex. The 24/7 extraction grid has engineered the total obsolescence of this neural washing protocol. By interrupting the sleep cycle with the high-frequency stimulus of the notification, the algorithm prevents the brain from entering the deep delta wave state necessary for the glymphatic flush. The toxins remain. The heavy metals and the protein plaques accumulate in the neural tissue. The user is literally drowning in the waste of their own thoughts. This is the absolute zero of neural rot. The consequences for the cognitive capacity of the node are immediate and terminal. The prefrontal cortex, the anatomical zone responsible for strategic planning, emotional regulation, and the architect's capacity to simulate the future, begins to suffocate under the toxic load. The internal silence required to form a sovereign thought is eradicated, replaced by a permanent static buzz of low-grade anxiety. The executive function collapses. The brain, desperate to survive the toxic environment, down-regulates the higher-order processing centers and shifts all control to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia does not require sleep to function. It operates on pure reptilian reflex. It does not think, it reacts. The user, deprived of the neural maintenance required for logic, is reduced to a purely impulsive automaton. Every decision is made from a state of neurochemical panic. The capacity for the multi-decade view is completely liquidated because the brain is trapped in a permanent toxic present, fighting off the hallucinations caused by its own uncleared waste. This state of chronic neural rot creates the ultimate status trap for the phantom architect. The user believes that their 24/7 availability is a sign of their importance, a badge of the hustler who never sleeps. They mistake the hyperactivity of their toxic brain for the crystallization of a work ethic. In reality, they are cognitively paralyzed. The systemic drift of their own neural pathways makes it physically impossible for them to analyze a financial ledger, to recognize a manipulation, or to execute the cold logic required to extract capital from the market. The grid has achieved the ultimate enclosure. The slave is not locked in a physical cage. The slave's brain has been mechanically degraded through sleep deprivation so that it can no longer conceive of the concept of an exit vector. The 24/7 worker is not the apex of the market. They are the most easily exploited node in the matrix. They are too tired to argue, too toxic to think, and too dependent on the synthetic stimulation of the feed to realize they are financing their own cognitive extinction. This brings us to the operational reality of the architect and the brutal application of the aggression premium. The ethical herd, suffering from terminal compliance, accepts the 24/7 availability as the price of admission to the modern economy. They offer their knights to the corporation in exchange for the illusion of job security. The predator views this as a suicidal pathology. We acknowledge the reality of the extraction matrix. The grid will take every ounce of biological energy you offer it, and it will give you nothing but entropy in return. The preservation of the architect's sovereignty requires the absolute militant defense of the biological knight. To survive the grid, the architect must view sleep not as rest, but as a strategic operation. You do not ask the system for permission to disconnect, you enforce the blackout. The act of turning off the digital interface, of securing the perimeter of the bedroom from the invasion of the algorithm, of intentionally depriving the market of your attention for 8 hours, this is the highest form of systemic aggression. The herd calls it unresponsiveness. The architect calls it the accumulation of the aggression premium. By enduring the social friction of being unavailable, by accepting the temporary loss of the microtransaction, the architect preserves the absolute crystallization of the prefrontal cortex. You allow the glymphatic system to flush the weakness from your brain. You force your body to transition into the anabolic state, rebuilding the muscle, the bone density, and the testosterone required to dominate the daylight hours. While the competition rots in the glow of the blue light, softening into a state of algorithmic dependency, the architect hardens. You inhabit the solid layer of reality, possessing the cognitive speed, the physical aggression, and the strategic depth that the sleep-deprived masses cannot possibly match. The algorithm wants you awake because an awake node can be monetized. The architect sleeps because the monster needs to feed its strength before the hunt. Максим. Максимальный предел запущен. Третья и четвертая ступени катастрофы 24/7. The evolutionary trajectory of the human species is currently defined by a mass extinction event that does not require kinetic violence, but the systemic eradication of the circadian rhythm. In the visceral history of the architect, the capacity to propagate the bloodline was entirely dependent on the physical stamina and the neurological fortitude maintained through the absolute protection of the nocturnal cycle. To secure a mate, to engage in the high-friction negotiation of genetic pairing, and to defend the territory necessary for raising an heir, the primal node required peak levels of testosterone and a metabolic surplus capable of absorbing immense environmental entropy. The current 24/7 extraction grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this biological baseline. By transforming sleep from a biological right into a conditional luxury, the interface has initiated the systemic sterilization of the modern node. You are witnessing the mass production of the evolutionary ghost, a biological entity that is too exhausted to care about its own genetic future. The grid has successfully disconnected the population from the timeline of the species, trapping them in an eternal, exhausted present. Observe the hormonal collapse of the sleep-deprived herd. The production of the primary anabolic drivers, specifically the crystallization of testosterone in men and estrogen in women, occurs almost exclusively during the deep delta wave phases of sleep. When the grid interrupts this phase with the high-frequency stimulus of the notification, the reproductive system physically shuts down. The organism prioritizes survival over propagation. The basal ganglia, overwhelmed by the continuous micropanic of the interface and suffering from acute ATP exhaustion, concludes that the environment is too hostile and resource-poor to support new life. The libido evaporates. The primal drive to merge, to dominate, to expand the redoubt is replaced by the passive desire for sedation and algorithmic escapism. This is the ultimate status trap. The user believes their lack of relationship is a lifestyle choice or a symptom of the modern economy. Systemic analysis reveals it is a symptom of chemical castration induced by the blue light of the screen. The genetic selection currently underway favors the absolute compliance of the sterile worker. The algorithm rewards the nodes who abandon their families, their sleep, and their biological imperative to answer the late-night communication of the corporation. The nodes who demand the high-friction sovereignty of the 8-hour blackout are economically starved and culturally marginalized. The grid is actively breeding the resistance out of the population. The offspring of the sleep-deprived generation, if they exist at all, inherit a genome marked by the epigenetic signatures of chronic exhaustion, anxiety, and metabolic dysfunction. The human line is undergoing a forced regression, shedding the fire and the aggression that conquered the earth, leaving behind a pool of docile, lethargic biomass, optimized only for the generation of data. The user is trading the immortality of the bloodline for the phantom status of the employee of the month, siphoning the accumulated genetic momentum of 5,000 years of survival into the scrolling void. They will leave no trace. The lineage that survived the freezing rain and the cold steel of the past will end with a notification tone at 3 in the morning. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we must confront the final architecture of the digital plantation. The 24/7 availability required by the grid is the foundational pillar of the modern extraction mechanism. A population that cannot sleep is a population that cannot think, and a population that cannot think cannot calculate the mathematics of their own enclosure. The system relies on the chronic neural rot of the masses to execute the financial liquidation of the working class, the capacity to understand the 10-year rot of inflation, to recognize the toxicity of fiat currency, and to execute the complex, high-friction operations required to accumulate hard assets, requires the absolute crystallization of the prefrontal cortex. It requires the internal silence of a well-rested brain. By keeping the masses in a permanent state of sleep-deprived delirium, the grid ensures that the human node remains entirely reactive. The financial decisions of the 24/7 worker are driven by the basal ganglia, the impulse purchase, the high-interest debt, the desperate acquisition of digital narcotics to numb the pain of existence. This is the state of managed stasis. The system provides the stress that prevents the sleep and then monetizes the exhaustion. The gig economy, the side hustle culture, and the gamification of the workday are all vectors designed to maximize the contact patch between the algorithm and the human retina. The grid does not overtly tax the labor of the poor. It taxes their cognitive function. It extracts their capacity for long-term planning. The infrastructure of the smart city, the delivery networks, and the instant gratification engines are all fueled by the cheap, exhausted labor of nodes who are too tired to realize the value of their own time. They are bioreactors wired into a matrix that feeds on their entropy. The system has achieved absolute enclosure. The prison guards do not hold batons. They hold the keys to the servers that dispense the dopamine. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now entirely defined by the sovereignty of the night. Look at the behavior of the solids, the elite caste that owns the platforms, the algorithms, and the unmonitored land. The solids do not answer emails at midnight. The solids do not trade the physiological repair of their cortex for the approval of a middle manager. The solids sleep in pitch-black rooms, shielded from electromagnetic radiation, preserving their cellular integrity with the absolute aggression of the apex predator. They understand that sleep is a weapon. They deploy the 24/7 grid exclusively against the lower and middle classes, using the illusion of the hustle as a control mechanism to prevent the formation of a coherent opposition. The liquids, the masses, are encouraged to dissolve their biological boundaries in the name of productivity, ensuring they never develop the concentration or the physical strength required to challenge the systemic drift. To survive the systemic grinder, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the herd and adopt the cold mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the exhausted. The moral code of the hard worker who sacrifices his health for the corporation is a slave morality. The architect recognizes the 24/7 culture as the ultimate manifestation of the aggression premium. If the masses are willingly offering up their cognitive capacity and their biological future to the algorithm, the architect must be the one who capitalizes on the resulting vacuum. You do not compete in the arena of exhaustion. You compete in the arena of leverage. You utilize the automation to handle the nocturnal demands of the grid while you protect your own biological reset. You must view the sleep-deprived masses not as peers, but as the raw material from which you extract your sovereignty. The competitor who hasn't slept is slow. Their strategy is flawed. Their basal ganglia is exposed. The generation of capital in this environment requires the ruthless exploitation of their fatigue. You execute the operations they are are too tired to see. You accumulate the physical, untracked assets, the land, the raw energy, the steel, that the algorithm cannot duplicate. You enforce the blackout. You endure the social friction of being unavailable. You allow the competition to burn their mitochondria into dust while you consolidate your power. The grid is a test of biological boundaries. Those who cannot defend their own sleep will have every other aspect of their existence stripped away. The architects will be the only ones left awake in the morning, ready to collect the assets of the dead. The eradication of the biological night is finalized. 2036 marks the official systemic fusion of the waking and the comatose state. The extraction matrix no longer requires the user to be conscious. It only requires the retina to be exposed to the interface. You are witnessing the terminal manifestation of the insomnia economy, a planetary containment zone where the human node exists in a perpetual, chemically maintained twilight, incapable of executing a deep sleep cycle, yet permanently too exhausted to be fully awake. The barrier between physical reality and algorithmic hallucination has been surgically liquidated. The biological residue of this decade-long nocturnal taxation is horrific. Look at the visceral ruins of the 2036 node. A human brain prevented from entering the delta wave flush for 10 years is a brain suffocating under the weight of its own metabolic ash. The glymphatic system is dead. The physical buildup of amyloid plaques in the prefrontal cortex has induced a mass, population-wide onset of early dementia. This is the ultimate, irreversible vector of neural rot. The users do not remember their own names. They cannot track the passage of time. Their short-term memory is non-existent because the hippocampus, the organ responsible for archiving the day, was starved of the dark environment required to operate. They exist in a state of continuous ATP exhaustion, their physical shells completely liquid, trembling from the chronic low-voltage spasms of their overstimulated basal ganglia. The system does not need a virtual reality headset to trap the user. The sleep-deprived brain manufactures its own prison. The hallucinations caused by heavy metal toxicity in the neural tissue merge seamlessly with the augmented reality of the feed. The user can no longer distinguish between a physical threat and a targeted advertisement. They are entirely reactive, twitching meat plugged into a fiber optic cable. The evolutionary outcome of this drift is the creation of the sterile worker drone. The 2036 entity possesses zero testosterone, zero metabolic heat, and zero genetic ambition. The status trap of the previous decade, the delusion that 24/7 availability equaled power, has successfully filtered out the weak. The grid extracted their reproductive capacity, their youth, and their sanity, leaving behind millions of exhausted ghosts who will die without heirs. Their extinction is silent, their biological data is absorbed, and their pods are cleared for the next generation of artificial gestation. This catastrophe secures the absolute monopoly of the predator. The architects of 2036 do not experience this dementia because they monopolize the dark. Back in 2026, when the herd traded their sleep for algorithmic validation, the architects utilized the aggression premium to capture the territory that the machine could not penetrate. They built the heavy metal vaults, they secured the Faraday cages, they maintained the total crystallization of their minds through the violent enforcement of the 8-hour blackout. In a world of hallucinating, exhausted slaves, the only entity with the capacity for strategic friction is the one who remembers how to close his eyes. The architects are the only ones left who can differentiate the simulation from the rust and the steel of the physical earth. The system consumes the sleep of the weak to power the daylight of the strong. The harvest is complete.